People in Myanmar are casting their ballots in the first election since a military coup ousted the civilian government in 2021. It's taking place amid a civil war and one of Asia's worst humanitarian crises. Sunday's voting is the first of 3 phases of the general election, which has been heavily criticized by the United Nations and Southeast Asia's ASEAN bloc. The ruling military junta claims the process marks the return of democracy, but opponents say the poll is an attempt by the army to try and win legitimacy on the global stage. Joining me now is journalist Tommy Walker, who is following this story from Bangkok. Tommy, why is Myanmar's military government choosing to hold elections now? That's almost 5 years after they retook power.
Yes, as you mentioned, it's nearly been 5 years since that military coup of 2021. Since then, there's been, raging civil war throughout the country, violent crackdowns on dissidents and opposition groups. Within Myanmar's constitution, after a state of emergency is declared, after it ends, elections must be held within 6 months. The military junta had announced state of elections several times since that coup. And this year was obviously the final time before these elections have been held. Obviously, they are looking to legitimize Myanmar, they say, to return the country to a democracy, to get people to vote. But given the fact that the National League of Democracy, which was the biggest party that won the 2020 elections prior to that coup, was dissolved and its leader, Aung San Suu Kyi, is in jail, there's no real, contested party coming up against these military-backed parties. So, critics, observers will say it's to legitimize their own rule, and that they've called these elections a sham. But the military wants that international recognition. It wants to show that it's holding these elections. But as you mentioned, they have been criticized as not being free or fair.
Yeah, with opponents saying that it is a sham, but the military junta believing that this would somehow bring more political stability to the country. Do you think that is true in the sense of consolidating their power?
I mean, if you look at the turnout from the footage, there's been a lot lower turnout this time around for these elections compared to those last elections in 2020. And that was during the COVID-19 pandemic as well. So, that just goes to show that the number of people are either refusing to vote, certainly amongst the youth, and certainly other several townships. There's dozens of townships that are not taking part in this poll, and that just goes to show that they don't trust the military. There's no parties for them to vote for because they've either been dissolved or banned. So in terms of what the military wants to do, it wants that international recognition to show that it's running a country which is, has civilian input and it's not just military rule. But, these elections as well, I mean, within Myanmar's constitution, 25% of parliamentary seats are kept for military-backed MPs anyway. So, even if there was some opposition that was more towards a democratic way of governing, the military would still have a proportion of seats there. Obviously, this time around, there aren't many parties there. They've been dissolved. Military-backed parties are heavily expected to win. We will hopefully know the results at the end of January after 3 phases of these polls.
And Tommy, something you said about young people appearing to be absent from the polls today. Could you talk just very quickly a little bit more about that? Should we read into it?
Absolutely, because the young people have been against this military coup. During those protests after the military coup in 2021, it was mostly youth-led. The revolution is what they called it, against the military, government and council. So young people voting just goes to show they don't see the military as their future. They don't see them as the legitimate government. And if the young people are voting and it's just the elderly people, it just begs the question: what's the future of Myanmar?
Journalist Tommy Walker in Bangkok, thank you very much.
For more, I'd like to welcome Yanghee Lee. She's a former special rapporteur on human rights in Myanmar and an academic in Seoul. Yanghee, how much public support is there for the junta?
There is really no support for the junta. If you're saying within Myanmar, the people do not support the military at all.
As we heard in the report, major opposition parties were barred from running candidates. Rebel-held territories aren't likely to vote. Is there any credibility in these elections?
Absolutely none whatsoever. There are about 330 townships in Myanmar, and elections will be carried out in 3 phases. Today, the junta announced 102 townships will be conducting elections, and just last night, 20 constituencies from phase 1, today's election, have been cancelled. And Myanmar's junta controls less than 40% of the territory. The junta has no control in thousands of village tracts within townships included in these 3 phases. And people are not really free to go and vote because there was no free campaigning. The opposition is not allowed to enter this election process. And many of the political prisoners are still in prison.
Given everything you've just said and the fact that that information, of course, is getting out into the international public, what's the point in having these elections at all?
Well, China wants stability in Myanmar, and Min Aung Hlaing has been dying to become the president of Myanmar since the past election. And they think that this is some kind of a charade, a show that will give them legitimacy. But in actuality, it's an egregious crime committed against the civilians in Myanmar. The escalated violence in the past few days is a testimony to what the situation is in Myanmar. How can you honestly feel free to go out and vote when your neighborhood is being bombed?
Meanwhile, the civilian leader Aung San Suu Kyi remains in jail, and her party is among those not participating in the elections. To what extent does her symbolic power still shape the opposition's morale and the public's perception of the legitimacy of this electoral process?
She still enjoys incredible support in terms of morale in the general public. But the younger generation, and since the people have experienced 5 years of ongoing coup, the revolutionary forces have gained more recognition by the younger generation and by the public, and they are now willing to risk everything, their lives, their livelihood, for a future of a free, fair, democratic, federal Myanmar.
Is there something here that some of us are not seeing? Will the election, by any measure, help the junta gain the global recognition it's looking for?
Well, he thinks it can, and it depends on the international community. If countries give him the legitimacy by agreeing to send in ambassadors and agreeing to meet with him and dealing with his military and the cronies, the international community is complicit to the egregious crimes that have been committed in the past 5 years, and furthermore, 70 years, during the 70 years of military rule, where there was enormous divide and rule and enormous atrocities committed against people. And let's not forget 2016 and 17, the Rohingya genocide.
That's Yanghee Lee, former Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Myanmar. Many thanks.
Thank you.